Today in Minneapolis, the trial of former officer Derek Chauvin continuing, and there was emotional testimony from George Floyd's brother and from a cardiologist who said George Floyd's death was, quote, absolutely preventable. Here's ABC's Alex Perez again tonight.
Emotional testimony as the prosecution moves to wrap up their part of the case before the defense gets its turn. The jury today hearing from George Floyd's younger brother, Philonise Floyd, describing this photo.
That's my mother. She's no longer with us right now, but that's my oldest brother, George. I miss both of them.
In his final moments, George Floyd called out for his mother. On the witness stand today, his brother describing their relationship as one of a kind.
He was a big mama's boy. He would lay up on her in the fetus position like he was still in a womb. He showed us how to treat our mom and how to respect our mom. He loved her so dearly.
The prosecution has called 38 witnesses, 10 of them doctors and other medical experts. Today, cardiologist Jonathan Rich knocking down defense claims Floyd's drug use and heart disease led to his death, saying Floyd would have lived if not for the officers.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether Mr. Floyd's death was preventable?
Yes, I believe that Mr. George Floyd's death was absolutely preventable.
A dozen members of law enforcement have testified against Derek Chauvin. Today, Seth Stoughton, a former officer and an expert on the use of force, summing up what so many others have said.
No reasonable officer would have believed that that was an appropriate, acceptable, or reasonable use of force.
So let's get back to Alex Perez with us again tonight from Minneapolis. And Alex, the defense now expected to begin its part of the case tomorrow?
Yeah, David, and we expect the defense's case will be much shorter than the prosecution's. The judge telling the jury today that they should expect closing arguments on Monday. He also told them to pack a bag because they will be sequestered once deliberations begin. David?
All right, Alex Perez there in Minneapolis. Thank you, Alex.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.
Defense team for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin continued presenting its case today, putting on the stand Dr. David Fowler, a former chief medical examiner for the state of Maryland. In stark contrast to the medical witnesses we heard from the prosecution, Dr. Fowler testified that the cause of George Floyd's death was, well, pretty much everything except Derek Chauvin. From Floyd's heart condition to drugs to even carbon monoxide poisoning because Floyd's head was close to the exhaust pipe of the responding squad car. Yeah, you heard that correctly. An exhaust pipe is now on trial. So it shouldn't surprise you that Fowler's entire testimony, frankly, imploded once prosecutor Jerry Blackwell picked apart his findings during cross-examination, starting with debunking the theory that Floyd died, in part, due to vehicle fumes.
Do you know if, in fact, the car was on or not? You didn't see any information or data from anybody who says, I either turned the car on or I'm the one who turned it off. You didn't see either one, did you?
Correct.
Was the car even on? Fowler, who had ruled out asphyxia in Floyd's death because of a lack of bruising on his neck, then admitted to Blackwell that bruises are rarely even a thing with this type of death.
Do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that the majority of cases where somebody dies of asphyxia are very subtle, and in fact, no traumatic manifestations are visible at all?
That is correct, depending on the circumstances.
Prosecutor Blackwell then nullified the studies Fowler had cited showing that restraint in a prone position with or without body weight does not cause difficulty breathing.
Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that none of the prone restraint studies that you referred to actually studied subjects who had someone's knee on their neck in the prone position? Is that true?
That is true.
None of the studies went for as long as 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Is that true?
That is true.
That, my friends, that is how you tear down a defense witness, by getting him to remarkably agree. with the prosecution. Joining me now is Phil Petit-Bogoff, co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity, and Miriam Moriarty, former chief public defender of Hennepin County, Minnesota. And Ms. Moriarty, I have to start with you first. That was a pretty clinic. It was pretty much a clinic the prosecutor put on in dismantling this witness. What did you make of that exchange today?
It was a really effective cross-examination. When he started out talking about the exhaust fumes, I almost thought at the beginning, okay, well, that seems so implausible. I'm almost glad that he's taking that position. He also was rendering opinions, giving opinions on cardiology, pulmonology, toxicology, and Mr. Blackwell got him to admit he doesn't have expertise in any of those areas. And if you recall, the state has called a cardiologist, a pulmonologist, and a toxicologist. And Mr. Blackwell got Fowler to admit he would defer to the opinions of a pulmonologist a number of times. So it was a really effective cross-examination.
It was amazing. And, you know, I had my Howard class today, and I said to them, you know, one of the things that you want to really do is always know who you're talking about, right? And so this gentleman, you know, who, he embarrassed himself a bit today. He got a little bit embarrassed today. He is a former Maryland official. He was here in Maryland. He is somebody who had cleared police in a previous police killing. He cleared police in the death of a man called Anton Black. In 2018, Anton Black died after 3 Maryland police officers were on top of his body for nearly 6 minutes. They continued pressing down on him for many minutes after he was handcuffed. Fowler's autopsy, because he was the guy in charge of that, the autopsy report ruled the death an accident and said there were no signs that police did anything wrong. So he's basically mostly an expert in saying police did nothing wrong. Your thoughts on that choice of somebody to testify for the defense, Philip?
Well, what we saw all of last week was everybody and anybody who could line up and get a spot from the Minneapolis Police Department saying, yeah, that was wrong. It's out of policy. There's no best practice that says it's okay. Absolutely, kneeling on somebody's trachea until they die is something we don't like to do. So I'm frankly impressed that the defense was able to get anybody with any kind of degree to come forward and say, maybe there was something else. And I want to be clear that if they left him up on the stand, he might well have said, you know, there's no evidence that aliens didn't kill him.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a person who no longer has that position, no longer requires that level of credibility. And that's what you're going to need to controvert everything that we all saw. We saw public lynching this summer. Everyone saw it. A random MMA fighter came by and called the cops on the cops. That's what we heard from last week. So you are going to need a fabulous to come in and provide anything like a shred of a credible a story in the other direction. And if you're even remotely prepared, as the prosecution was in this case, that's going to fall apart almost instantly. You got to be glad about that. And also, this case on one trial, right, on one officer, it's so far short of what we're seeing protesters talk about in the streets in Minneapolis today.
That is a very good point. It's true. And I think that people are thinking about, they're trying to, process all of these cases at once, Philip. They're trying to process the fact that this other officer is now being charged. But you are seeing, listen, in Minnesota, at least now we've had 3 officers charged in deaths of civilians. The only one convicted, as was noted in the last block by Johnny Cobb, is the black guy who killed the white lady. But it does feel like there is more momentum toward prosecutors at least trying. Right, Philip? And is that what it's going to take? We've seen Marilyn Mosby try. We've seen other prosecutors at least say, you know what, we need to at least attempt a prosecution. Is that, in your view, progress?
I don't know. I'm less embarrassed by the prosecution in this case. It's been incredibly thorough. That's great. But it's not just the prosecution coming forward and doing their job effectively and professionally. It's also the profession saying, please don't pin this on us. Right. Part of what's happening is if there is a not guilty, God help us all. And I think everybody in law enforcement understands there's no way to do the job if this is somehow part of what's legal. So everybody's coming together saying, let's accept this. Let's make this the one random error that doesn't indict the entire profession. And so, you're seeing some momentum in that way, but I don't think that generalizes. I don't think that's going to happen in the Dante Wright case, and I don't think that makes us all safer or makes black people feel like, oh, now it's good with us and the cops.
Well, and right. And Mary Moriarty, the other group of people that have had a credibility issue are prosecutors, because we've seen even Democratic prosecutors who get votes from black people refuse to prosecute in cases like the Mike Brown case, in cases like Breonna Taylor. And so prosecutors are sort of under the spotlight, too, because we do have this sense that, you know, white citizens are treated as citizens and black citizens are treated as subjects. And they're simply the people who police on, but not the people that police protect. In your view as a prosecutor, coming from the point of view of the partners of the police, what do we need to do to get off of this dime? Because this is not a place that's sustainable.
Well, remember that this case was taken away by the county prosecutor and given to the attorney general, partly because of that very issue. I see a potential for tremendous change here. Our community, this didn't start with George Floyd, obviously. There's a history with the Minneapolis Police Department that people in our community, particularly in our Black community, have been trying to bring to the attention of police, of policy officials, and it's been ignored for years and years and years. George Floyd was like our Ferguson moment. That was just kind of the eruption of all of this trauma, this tension, this anguish over what had been happening to people in our Black community for many, many years. And I don't think any of us want it to go, well, we're not going to let it go back to the way it was. It's not going to go back to normal. There's tremendous pressure and actually willingness on a lot of our policymakers' part to make changes, to see that this, I mean, it obviously did happen again right in the middle of this trial, but there's tremendous momentum here to try to change this. I'll also say to Philip's point about the MPD getting on the stand and saying this isn't who we are and what we do.
Right.
People in the community have noticed that, and of course, people in the Black community know, and as a former public defender, I see body cam where police treat people like this all the time. It just
is what they do.
Always in death.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is what
and that's
they
the
do.
problem. It is what they do. That's the problem. They're treating Black people as subjects and not as citizens, and that is the problem. Philippa Goff, Mary Moriarty, thank you both very much.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.
Now to testimony from a key witness at Derek Chauvin's murder trial, the medical examiner who ruled George Floyd's death a homicide. Now, his testimony is important because Chauvin's lawyers were hoping it would bolster their claim that drugs and heart issues were to blame for Floyd's death. CBS's Jamie Yuccas reports from Minneapolis.
Tonight, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy on George Floyd took the stand. Dr. Andrew Baker told jurors that while heart disease and drugs played a role, it was the interaction with police that caused Floyd's death.
The law enforcement subdual, restraint, and the neck compression was just more than Mr. Floyd could take by virtue of those heart conditions.
On the death certificate, Dr. Baker listed the drugs found in Floyd's system and heart ailments as contributing conditions, not causes.
Mr. Floyd's use of fentanyl did not cause the subdual or neck restraint. His heart disease did not cause the subdual or the neck restraint.
But during cross-examination, the defense continued to focus on Floyd's drug use.
You're aware also of the methamphetamine that was found in Mr. Floyd's system?
Yes. I'm not an expert in the specific toxicology of methamphetamine. As a general rule for forensic pathology, methamphetamine is not good for a damaged heart.
This was not a sudden death.
Forensic pathology expert Lindsay Thomas is a former county medical examiner who trained Baker. She testified Floyd died from asphyxia or low oxygen, terms not mentioned in Baker's autopsy report.
The activities of the law enforcement officers resulted in Mr. Floyd's death.
Meanwhile, Minneapolis residents are following the trial closely.
Yeah, you can just sit here.
Pastor Edwin Williams has been listening to the concerns of his predominantly Black neighborhood.
I'm absolutely afraid that if a non-guilty verdict or some sort of technicality is used to keep the officer from facing responsibility for this, that we'll see worse than what we saw last summer.
The trial is moving quicker than originally thought, so the prosecution is now expected to rest its case early next week. All eyes will then turn to the defense and whether or not Chauvin will testify. Nora?
Jamie Yukas, thank you.
So, Doctor, let's talk about your opinions regarding the cause of Mr. Floyd's death.
Yes, sir.
You formulated opinions.
Yes, sir, I did.
Would you tell us what your opinion or opinions are?
Mr. Floyd died from positional asphyxia, which is a fancy way of saying he died because he had no oxygen left in his body.
So what we've been referring to as low oxygen.
Low oxygen is one way, no oxygen. When the body is deprived of oxygen, and in this case from his chest, pressure on his chest and back, he gradually succumbed to lower and lower levels of oxygen until it was gone and he died.
Did you consider other possibilities as causes that you evaluated and dismissed as unlikely?
Absolutely.
Was one of those excited delirium?
Yes, sir, it was.
Would you first tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what excited delirium is?
Excited delirium is a physical and psychiatric state where, because of an imbalance in the brain, a patient will exhibit multiple symptoms. Basically, they are hot, their body is revved up, heart rate is up, respiration is up, superhuman strength. They are out of control. Their speech is garbled. It doesn't make sense. They can't answer questions. That's what they call the delirium, someone who is delirious. So I'm very familiar with not only pre-hospital, but in the hospital, the symptoms of excited delirium.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
You and I have had several discussions throughout the course of my representation of you relevant to your right to testify or to choose to remain silent, correct?
That's correct.
And during the course of our representation, it's fair to say that you and I have had this conversation multiple times, correct?
Correct.
You understand that you have a Fifth Amendment privilege to remain silent. Do you understand that?
Yes.
You understand that if you choose to exercise that right to remain silent, neither the state nor the court can comment on your silence as a sign or an indication of your guilt. Meaning they can't say, he didn't get up and defend himself, so equate your silence with guilt. Do you understand that?
Yes.
All right. Now, you also understand that you can waive that right and testify. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
You understand that if you chose not to testify, or if you did in fact testify, you would be subject to cross-examination by the state of Minnesota.
Yes.
You understand that if you were cross-examined by the state, we could not attempt to limit the scope of your testimony. The state would be given broad latitude to ask you questions. Do you understand that?
Yes.
We've had this conversation repeatedly, correct?
Correct.
I have repeatedly advised you that this is your decision and your decision alone, right?
Correct.
I have advised you, and we have gone back and forth on the matter, would be kind of an understatement, right?
Yes, it is.
But after a lengthy meeting last night, we had some further discussion, agreed?
Correct.
And have you made a decision today whether you intend to testify or whether you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege?
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
Right. Mr. Chauvin, I'm going to address you directly because the decision whether or not to testify, take this off, is entirely yours. In other words, it's a personal right. Mr. Nelson makes a lot of the decisions in trial, but one he cannot make for you is whether or not you testify. And he can give you advice, and you can take that advice or reject that advice. But the decision ultimately has to be yours and not his. Is this your decision not to testify?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. Do you have any questions about your right to remain silent or to testify on your own behalf?
Not at this time, I don't.
All right. Does anyone promised anything or threatened you in any way to keep you from testifying?
No promises or threats, Your Honor.
Do you feel that your decision not to testify is a voluntary one on your behalf?
Yes, it is.
Now, in addition to that, I'm convinced then that this is your personal decision and that you are aware of your rights. But there is a jury instruction that may be read to the jury. This, again, is the one that you get to weigh in on. It's not for your lawyer to make the decision. Again, he can give you advice, and I don't want to know what the advice is, but you can accept the advice or reject the advice as to whether or not to give this instruction. If you would like, I can read this instruction to the jury. It's titled, Defendant's Right Not to Testify. The state must convince you by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of the crime charged. The defendant has no obligation to prove innocence. The defendant has the right not to testify. This right is guaranteed by the federal and state constitutions. You should not draw any inference from the fact that the defendant has not testified in this case. Do you understand that instruction?
Yes, Your Honor.
Would you like that read to the jury?
Yes, Your Honor.
Have you had enough time to talk to Mr. Nelson about whether that's a good idea or not?
I have, Your Honor.
All right. And so I will read that to the jury on your request.
Thank you.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
The defense has just rested its case. Chauvin did not take the stand, choosing instead to invoke the Fifth Amendment. Leading us off this hour, NBC News correspondent Gabe Gutierrez and NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos. Gabe, let's start with you. We heard a pulmonologist say he did not believe that carbon monoxide was to blame, battling what defense experts said just yesterday. So what's been the reaction to that? What else have we heard from the courtroom today?
Well, Morgan, it's actually been a jam-packed morning, and let me work my way backwards. A lot has happened in just the last few moments. The defense rested, as you mentioned, but then the prosecution has rested as well after calling its rebuttal witness. And now the judge says that closing arguments are set for Monday. So essentially the jury is going home for now. We'll have tomorrow off. We'll come back here on Monday, hear closing arguments, get their jury instructions, and then begin deliberations on Monday. The jury will then be sequestered. Before that, Dr. Martin Tobin, one of the expert witnesses that the prosecution had previously called, was called back to the stand as a rebuttal witness to get into that issue that you mentioned, Morgan, about carbon monoxide poisoning that the defense brought up yesterday. He said that he believed that had nothing to do with George Floyd's death. He reiterated that he thought George Floyd died due to lack of oxygen. Before that, Morgan, there was also some developments because the prosecution, during motions away from the jury, had brought up that they wanted to introduce new evidence, these lab tests that got to that issue of carbon monoxide poisoning. They said they had just heard from one of their witnesses, the medical examiner, and that he had drawn their attention to these lab tests. The judge said, no, that is not admissible because he says that is not how they should operate. That evidence should not be introduced at this point. And if they got into that testimony at all, he hinted that it could be a mistrial. So he said no. Before that, Morgan, we heard from Derek Chauvin outside of the view of the jury. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right not to testify. Here is what he said in court without the jury present. Take a listen.
Is this your decision not to testify?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. Do you have any questions about your right to remain silent or to testify on your own behalf?
Not at this time, I don't.
All right. Has anyone promised anything or threatened you in any way to keep you from testifying?
No promises or threats, Your Honor.
Do you feel that your decision not to testify is a voluntary one on your behalf?
Yes, it is.
So, Morgan, that had been one of the looming questions on this trial. Would Derek Chauvin himself take the stand? And we now know that he will not. And again, the prosecution and the defense have rested. Closing arguments now set for Monday, Morgan.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.